What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, so we are getting into the origin of the Orange Lanterns, also known as Agent Orange. Now, here's the cool thing about this. This is the last prelude that we cover before we finally get into Blackest Night. I'm pretty sure it is, although now that I think about it, I think Emerald Eclipse might be the last prelude that we do. I'll have to double check and make sure. I looked at my schedule earlier and I'm pretty sure it's Emerald Eclipse. But in terms of the Lantern Corps, the Orange Lantern, in truth, I would argue is probably the most powerful of the Lantern Corps. And the only reason for this isn't the nature of the Corps itself, it's how the Corps is used. But before we get into that, what we do here is we pick up with a group called the Controllers. Now, the Controllers first appeared in Adventure Comics number 357, I think it was, back in 1967, and they were an offshoot of the Guardians of the Universe. Now, if you're just now joining us with regards to all our Green Lantern mythos and our Green Lantern stuff, the Guardians of the Universe are this extremely old race. They've been alive for billions and billions of years. They were originally a race called the Malthusians, and the idea was that one of their member, a guy by the name of Krona, wanted to witness the beginning of all things. The problem with this was that in doing so, he basically created the antimatter universe, or the origin of evil, in the DC universe, and the result is that that led to the events that eventually became Crisis on Infinite Earths. Now, the idea here is that with the Controllers themselves, what they ended up doing is where some of the Malthusians, some of the women broke off and became the Zamorons, who were basically the creators of the Star Sapphire's Lantern Corps. The Controllers broke off, and then they just kind of isolated different sections of the universe. For the most part, they were background characters. Now, what this does is it brings into the idea that there were sections of the universe that the Green Lanterns were not allowed to enter, and they were not allowed to enter under the ruling of the Guardians of the Universe. When the Guardians of the Universe made the Green Lantern Corps, they'd already been around for quite some time, and the idea was that for whatever reason, no one could ever enter the Vega system. Now, we end up having the Controllers enter this area, and when they do, it's just kind of this disembodied voice talking about how the Guardians of the Universe broke their promise, the Guardians of the Universe betrayed them, the Controllers themselves want to basically defeat the Guardians of the Universe, take their rightful place as the ruler of the universe, and they believe they can achieve this by basically capturing the orange light of avarice, the greed aspect of the emotional spectrum. Now remember, if you're new to this, when it comes to the Green Lantern mythos, originally it was just the Green Lanterns and then Sinestro, who had a yellow lantern ring. The idea with Jeff Johns in terms of him revamping it all was to basically come along and say there is something called the emotional spectrum, and the emotional spectrum is basically, it really just kind of exists as an extension of all emotion that exists in the universe. So as long as there are people who feel rage, fear, people who feel hope, those aspects of the emotional spectrum will always be there. Greed is one of the aspects of the emotional spectrum, but where the Green Lantern Corps has, all these different members who exist to serve as a police force, because this is the emotion of greed, there's only ever one member of the Orange Lantern Corps. Now, we don't initially see who this guy is. Instead, the Controllers are just kind of set upon by all these orange constructs and effectively just ripped to pieces. Now, what this does is this comes out of the last video that we did, where we basically covered the Blue Lanterns. Again, the Blue Lanterns are the Lantern Corps of Hope. Now, a lot of people look to the Blue Lanterns and say, in terms of overall corps, which is to say corps that consist of more than one person, the Blue Lanterns are the most powerful. And in a lot of ways they are, just because of the different abilities they have, the kind of things that they can do. They're more of a support Lantern Corps. But again, all the lanterns have their caveats. A Blue Lantern ring is basically useless. It's not really effective unless it's in the presence of a Green Lantern. And the reason for that is because the Blue Lanterns were created by Ganthet and Sade, two of the Guardians of the Universe who believed in the idea that the prophecy of Blackest Night was going to come true, which is to say a war between all the Lantern Corps. In order to prepare for this war of light, they created the Blue Lanterns. The problem with this is that they were outcast from the Guardians of the Universe. They were basically banished, and so the idea that Hal Jordan is essentially bonded with a Blue Lantern ring and a Green Lantern ring is basically this idea that the original indication seemed to be that he was going to be the leader of the Blue Lantern Corps. The problem with this is that with him having this ring, he can't just remove it. In fact, there's basically an effect on this ring that he can't remove it until he's able to wield the Lantern ring. Now, this is really just designed to allow Hal Jordan to tap into the various aspects of the emotional spectrum, and that's really what Jeff Johns was shooting for when he did did this. Keep in mind, when it comes to the Green Lantern mythos in DC, Hal Jordan is front and center. He's the front runner to all that. And so the idea here is that Geoff Johns was working on this ideology of basically having Hal Jordan go through all these different experiences with the Lantern rings. And what that would do is it would give the reader a clearer understanding of what the rings were capable of. Because it's one thing to see like the Indigos, suddenly show up and use their Lantern rings and so on and so forth. And then it's another to have Hal Jordan become one of their Lanterns and then basically give us an explanation of what the ring is capable of. But with this whole situation, he simply just, again, cannot remove the ring. And so at this point, he's just trying to cope with it as best he can. Now, what also ends up happening here is he actually bails out for the purpose of trying to find Sinestro. So again, all this really kind of comes to a head leading up to this massive War of Light, this huge, Blackest Night event that's going to take place. The problem with this is that as soon as Hal Jordan takes off on his mission, he's immediately brought before the other members of the Guardians of the Universe, who look at him and say, "You've been tainted by Ganthet and Sade. They are outcasts. You are not to associate with them." One thing to keep in mind is the Guardians of the Universe play the Green Lanterns pretty close to the vest. There's not a lot of wiggle room for Green Lanterns to kind of do what it is that they want to do. There's a very strict set of rules that the Green Lanterns have to follow. They can't use their rings for selfish purposes. They have to use them for the purpose of operating as police, more or less, or I guess a protective force in the DC universe. Now, of course, with the Guardians of the Universe more or less trying Hal Jordan, or at the very least intending to basically remove the Blue Lantern ring from him, some of the Green Lanterns basically traveling back with a piece of the Orange Lantern itself, what this ends up revealing is the presence of Larfleeze. Now, Larfleeze is super powerful, but before we get into why, what we end up doing here is basically having this explanation that there was a deal that was struck, more or less, between the Guardians of the Universe and Larfleeze. They stay away, he stays away, everybody stays fine. It's just a totally neutral thing. What ended up happening is that with the controllers entering into the Vega system for the purpose of pursuing the Orange Lantern Light of Greed, what ended up happening is that Larfleeze interpreted this as the Guardians violating their treaty, basically invading the Vega system. And the result was that he looks at this as an act of aggression and says, fine, if you attack, I attack too. And that leads into his whole presence here. Now, one of the things that we do is we actually switch over to a character named Fatality. Now, all of this goes all the way back to a story called Cosmic Odyssey, and it was actually issue number 2, and it was written by Jim Starlin in 1989. Now, this was kind of a spacefaring story, but one of the elements was designed to focus on John Stewart as a character. Keep in mind, when it came to the different Green Lanterns, first there was Hal Jordan, then there was John Stewart, followed by Guy Gardner, and then eventually Kyle Rayner. But John Stewart's character being fleshed out was again designed to make him more human, because remember, when it came to the Green Lantern mythos before the whole original Green Lantern Rebirth story and this huge run by Geoff Johns, Green Lantern was always struggling to sell. DC always had one heck of a time trying to get people to read his stories. And the result was that they began bringing in different versions of the Green Lanterns on Earth, really kind of bringing in like John Stewart as a companion of sorts to Hal Jordan for the purpose of bringing in readers who wouldn't normally read those stories. The idea here, though, was that this story dealt with the anti-life equation. Of course, the anti-life equation being most well known as a Jack Kirby creation and basically serving as a means that if somebody's able to decipher the anti-life equation and harness it, they can dominate the wills of others. But what this ended up doing is it brought both John Stewart and Martian Manhunter to a planet called Xanshi. At least I think it's pronounced Xanshi. It's Xanshi. I assume that's how it's pronounced. But the idea here is that with Xanshi, what we ended up finding out was that there was basically this massive bomb in the core of the planet. But with John Stewart being a bit reckless, with John Stewart kind of getting carried away with his powers to a degree, he ultimately was not able to keep the bomb from detonating. And the result is that it wiped out the entire planet of Xanshi, destroyed all of its native inhabitants. Now, this was important because the character of Fatality, really her name being Yara Sindril, I think is how you pronounce it, she was basically one of the members of this planet. Of course, she was off-world at the time that it happened, but the idea was that John Stewart had basically destroyed everything she knew and loved. And so from 1989 going up to the time this story is written, she had largely served as this on-again, off-again villain of John Stewart in the sense that she would pop up from time to time. But it was a way for DC to basically give John Stewart his own version of Sinestro. And so because of this, what ended up happening is during Sinestro Corps War, because she was such an enemy of John Stewart, she became a member of the Sinestro Corps. This led into the end of Sinestro Corps War itself. She was captured by the Star Sapphires, and they basically began modifying her for the purpose of turning her into a Star Sapphire. And so again, with Star Sapphires being driven by love as the one emotion they feel more than anything else, what this does is it sends Fatality on a quest to basically find John Stewart. Now, of of course, this again leads directly into the whole Vegas system. This basically results in the Guardians of the Universe and Hal Jordan, along with the other Green Lanterns, seeking out Larfleeze. Because again, at this point, Larfleeze is kind of this unstable element. He's kind of this guy where no one really knows what he's going to do. He's very much a variable in this whole situation. But despite everything that's going on, remember, Hal Jordan is largely plagued by the Blue Lantern ring. Now, for the most part, it works out in his benefit, because remember, the Blue Lantern rings bolster the power of the Green Lantern ring. And so what this basically does is it basically, it really amplifies what it is that he's able to do. One ring charges the other. And so because of that, it's constantly keeping his power at absolute max 100% of the time. Now, of course, when they end up arriving on the Vega system, they're immediately met with these orange constructs of Larfleeze. And that's the difference between the way his core works and other cores. Because of the fact that Larfleeze is the only member of the Orange Lantern Corps, what he does is he basically kills people and then duplicates their essence and turns them into constructs. What this does is it gives him a limitless supply of constructs to create. So long as there are people out there that he can kill, they get bolstered and added to his Lantern Corps. Now, the other half of this is that he's been doing this for quite some time. More so than that, what ends up happening is the Green Lanterns, when they face off against the Orange Lantern Corps, they're basically facing off against former friends and allies. And that's what makes this so difficult, because they're basically forced to fight people they fought alongside at one point along the line. But that's the nature of the Green Lanterns, overcoming fear. And so in the face of all this, what they basically have to do is come to grips with the fact that these constructs as they exist are not the people that they knew, and there's no way to get them back. They're effectively gone. Now, at the same time, because of the fact that Hal Jordan is wielding a Blue Lantern ring, Larfleeze, of course, tries to acquire it for himself. And that's the other half of the story when it comes to his character. Larfleeze, with all the power that he possesses, quite literally takes on the entirety of the Guardians of the Universe and the Green Lantern Corps all at the same time. And the reason why is because as the only Orange Lantern, he's mainlining those powers. Remember, he's greedy. He keeps everything to himself. And of course, we'll find out why here in a little bit. He would never trust his Orange Lantern, or his Orange Central Power Battery, to anybody else. What this means is that with the Green Lantern, for example, the Green Lantern Central Power Battery operating as the source of energy for all the Green Lanterns that exist out in the universe, if you were to take that Green Lantern Central Power Battery, you were to take all the other Green Lanterns' powers away, and then you were to plunge that Green Lantern Central Power Battery into a singular person, they would be almost unstoppable. And in fact, that's a statement that the Guardians of the Universe make. What they do is they basically say Larfleeze is a threat on par with Hal Jordan when he was Parallax. Now, for those of you guys who are new and you don't know what that means, back in 1993, when DC was basically trying to revamp the Green Lantern mythos and look to kill off Hal Jordan and replace him with Kyle Rayner, what they did is they launched a story called Emerald Twilight. And this came out of the death of Superman. Following Superman being killed at the hands of Doomsday, cyborg Superman rose to prominence, and then alongside one of Superman's most notable enemies, a guy named Mongol, attacked Coast City, the home of Hal Jordan. Now, Hal Jordan was off planet at the time that happened, but when he came back, he found out that everything that he knew and loved was totally destroyed. Now, initially, he coped with it as best he could by using his Lantern ring to recreate everything around him. This, of course, violated the laws of the Guardians of the Universe in that you can't use a ring for selfish purposes. He was brought back to Oa, he was chastised, he lost his mind, wiped out all the Green Lanterns that were in existence, was possessed by Parallax, the living embodiment of fear, and then basically went on this crusade to try to blink the multiverse out of existence and bring it back. It was absolutely nuts. But the big takeaway from all this is that Hal Jordan as Parallax was one of the most, if not the most, powerful being in existence at that time. Larfleeze seems to be on par with that. Now, this is in terms of the power that he can use, what he can create. I wouldn't go as far as to say that Larfleeze can basically try to destroy the universe. It's entirely possible, but there's no reason to believe that that's true at the time this story is being written with regards to Agent Orange. But again, because of the fact that he's so obsessed with collecting things for himself, with all the power that he has, what we also end up finding out here is that the Orange Lantern ring, the orange constructs created by Larfleeze himself, have the ability to absorb constructs of other Lantern Corps. And so essentially what's happening is the Green Lanterns, the Guardians of the Universe, they're fighting off Larfleeze as best they can, but none of their weapons have any real impact. And so the result of all this is that Larfleeze is basically running amok on these guys. He's absolutely wrecking these guys. And so the result is that while these constructs are out fighting against the Guardians of the Universe, he basically gives his story to Hal Jordan. But something that I want you to take note of when it comes to these constructs is that they're not really being controlled directly by Larfleeze. And that's one of the other big differences here. When Larfleeze conjures his constructs, they function according to the will of Larfleeze but they do it in their own capacity. If Larfleeze says, I want those guys to die, and he conjures constructs, those constructs can think for themselves, they're sentient, they can do what it is they want to do, but they'll be driven by the motivation to kill whoever it is that Larfleeze wants to see dead. What we end up finding out here is that Larfleeze and a handful of other guys were basically scavengers slash thieves, but the idea was that they were in the midst of this heist because supposedly there was rumor that there was a treasure so great that even the Guardians of the Universe would seek it out, that they would covet that. Now, once they went to this treasure room, once they basically located it, they ended up finding out this was the Orange Lantern Ring. Now, we're not explicitly told how that lantern ring got there, but the idea is that because this represents the greed aspect of the emotional spectrum, as soon as all four guys lay eyes on it, they're immediately driven by the desire to covet it for themselves. This, of course, leads to the arrival of the Guardians of the Universe who realize what's going on. But with Larfleeze harnessing the central power battery on his own, what this does is it leads to him just going on an absolute rampage. And so the result of this was that a bargain was struck between the Guardians of the Universe and Larfleeze. Again, like we said earlier, the Guardians stay away, Larfleeze stays away. They never allow Green Lanterns to go to that area. The only people who do go through there are those who just kind of stumble, make mistakes, and just happen to cross the path of Larfleeze, after which almost none of them are ever seen or heard from again. Larfleeze will kill them and then just hoard whatever it is that they have. He's literally the epitome of a hoarder. But the idea here is that with Larfleeze essentially seeming to overcome Hal Jordan, he quite literally takes the Blue Lantern Ring away from him. What we end up finding out is that this is actually a ruse. The Blue Lantern Ring basically protected itself by creating kind of a telepathic image. The idea here is that the Blue Lantern Ring tricks Larfleeze into believing that he actually has access to it when he really doesn't. Now, of course, this results in Hal Jordan basically bolstering his Green Lantern Ring, using the Blue Lantern Ring, and then just attacking Larfleeze as best he can. But again, there's no absolute way for them to win here because Larfleeze is so powerful. And so in the midst of all this, Hal Jordan does the only thing he can do and literally takes the orange power battery away. Which is kind of a cool thing. But this is, again, another example that we were talking about with Jeff Johns basically having Hal Jordan tour these roles of the different Lantern Corps. In this instance, with him acquiring the Orange Lantern Central Power Battery, the result is that he immediately is overcome by greed in every sense of the word. He wants to eat everything. He wants to collect everything. He wants absolute power. He's driven by the desire to gather everything around him. This is my Central Power Battery. No one can have it. It's absolutely mine. That's what makes this so cool, is because, again, the emotional spectrum is designed to represent these various emotions that people feel. The other half of this is that with Larfleeze, again, being the only person who has access to the central power battery of the Orange Lantern Corps, what he ends up doing is just supercharging himself. And so where the ring normally functions at like 100% capacity or something along those lines, he supercharges it 70 times over, basically bringing it to a charge of 7,000 times more powerful than it normally is, or I guess 70 times more powerful than it normally is at 7,000%. We're talking about a level of power that almost no one really seems to be able to cope with, no one really seems to be able to do anything with. Now again, this brings in the second aspect of the Blue Lantern Ring. Because the Blue Lantern Ring kept chiming in and saying, what is it that you hope for? Hal Jordan basically responds by saying, I hope you stop asking me that question. Now, this is a big deal when it comes to the Blue Lantern Rings, and it's part of that whole caveat that a person constantly has to feel hope. When you're imbued with a Blue Lantern Ring, you have to feel legitimate, true, and untainted hope, which is to say you genuinely believe what it is that you're hoping for. So again, with this idea of Hal Jordan saying, I hope it'll stop asking me this question, it's legitimate hope. Now, it doesn't mean that like his wildest dreams are going to come true. What it means is it allows him to tap into the Blue Lantern Ring. Now, this hope that he feels is contextual, right? Like, you know, if for example, Hal Jordan were to say, I really like having this Blue Lantern Ring, then he wouldn't hope to be rid of it anymore. And the result is that his hope would have to shift to something else. He would have to hope for something and then use that as the anchor that keeps him connected to the Blue Lantern Ring. But in this moment right now, because of the fact that he's able to tap into the ring in its full power, what it does is it reveals that the Blue Lantern Ring is immune to the effects of avarice. It's immune to the Orange Lantern Ring. And that's why this is so powerful, because when it comes to the Blue Lanterns, they're designed to basically oppose all forms of evil. And so the idea is that in addition to opposing all forms of evil and at the same time offering itself as a support role to all forms of good, it's basically the backbone of almost all the Lantern Corps. And that's why it's so important. That's why it's so powerful. It's the foundation by which almost all these houses sit. And so the result is that while he feels it momentarily, while Larfleeze is basically overcome, when this is done, when it's over with, the ring basically takes off. That was the condition. The ring would leave as soon as Hal Jordan was able to wield it. But again, this is part of that whole idea of Ganthet and Sade, these two exiled members of the Guardians of the Universe, looking to the future, basically saying, if this war of light is going to happen, then it's important that Hal Jordan, among all others, be exposed to these various Lantern Corps so that he knows how to deal with them accordingly. And so because of this, when everything basically winds down and it comes to an end, the Guardians of the Universe strike another bargain with Larfleeze. We're not initially told what this bargain is. Instead, the Green Lanterns are basically sent back, the Guardians of the Universe travel back to Oa, and we end up finding out that the request that was made by Larfleeze was to know the location of the Blue Lantern Corps. Now again, this works out for the Guardians of the Universe, the ones that are currently occupying it. Because remember, with Ganthet and Sade being exiles, they've basically been branded as heretics, as people who are fearmongers. The idea that they're espousing this whole war of light, blackest night, it goes directly in line with what the normal Guardians of the Universe are trying to do, which is basically ignore the war of light. And so what this does is it allows them to kill two birds with one stone. If they send Larfleeze over to the Blue Lantern Corps, most likely it'll be a conflict that will see deaths on both sides. Even if Larfleeze is defeated and not all the Blue Lanterns die, it could result in the death of Ganthet and Sade, which means that there would be nobody left to make any Blue Lanterns. Not only that, it would probably also see the wholesale slaughter of the Blue Lanterns themselves. And so it would basically allow the existing Guardians of the Universe to wipe out those they consider to be adversaries in one fell swoop. It'll literally just bring them all out. You know, it'll just take them all out in their entirety. So again, this is really just kind of how sinister some of these Guardians are. It's really how they look at the things around them and say, it's time to basically bring everything under our wing and to carve the universe out in a way that we perceive to be it existing in our image. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna go ahead and bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.